And now we are live.
Got it. Hey, good morning. Selamat pagi to our friends in Kuala Lumpur, Salam Sejahtera, and also for friends joining in different parts of the world. I hope you're doing well. We are aware that we have friends from in different time zones, so thank you for joining us this morning. So my name's Arman, and I represent the Empowerment Group for the Global Empowerment Summit organized by my good friend Andrea. So thank you for all your effort to make this summit a success. So this morning, I'll be speaking about a topic which is important to all of us, right? It's discussed, but at the same time, not discussed often, right? And it's called freedom from toxic masculinity. What I mean by it's being discussed and not discussed is something that we are aware about, but at the same time, we really don't often know how to deal with it. So I hope we can shed light a little bit about toxic masculinity, how it affects society and men themselves, right? And how we men can empower ourselves and communities to bring change and to actually deal with our emotions better. So with that, I'll start off and with the question for you to think about, right? Boys don't cry. And there's a question mark there intentionally, right? So these are some of the stereotypes that we grew up with in society. And the question is, right, that how valid is that and how healthy is that there? So with that, let's get started off. Please do participate and contribute to the discussion. I wanted to be as participative as possible. I do understand from Andrea that I have roughly about 35 minutes to go, and then after that we'll have open Q&A, which will not be live. But in the meantime, to all our friends who are joining on YouTube, Facebook, and other platforms, thank you for joining us as well. So, what do we want to cover today? First, men's mental health. What makes that important, right? I mean, mental health is important, but what makes men's mental health particularly important? When I shared today's session with some of my friends, and like some response was, "Is it only for men?" I said, "Of course not. In fact, rather the opposite. We do want everyone to be involved in this discussion about men's mental health." Then I'll talk about toxic masculinity, the cultural norms underpinning it, right? And what is the implications? What does that mean, right, for society and men themselves? And finally, what can we do really to start a discussion and break the stigma, right, to get help from men who need professional help for the challenges that they're going through, or even just getting help, self-help, or help from the community and those around them. So with that, let me move on. I'll tell you a little bit of the empowerment group before I start off that I represent. I'm a co-partner and founder here. The TEG is a global partnership between mental health providers in Malaysia, Australia, Singapore, and Indonesia. And our focus is really empowering individuals, organizations, and communities with evidence-based, culturally sensitive, and holistic mental health tools, which lead to productivity, well-being, growth, and happiness. So the important part here is that we want to address underserved communities and underserved topics. And toxic masculinity is one of those topics, as I said, right, that is discussed, but yet not discussed. And important for mental health and beyond that for the well-being of society. To introduce myself and my partners, so we are led by Dr. Iopeli, a very senior counselor and well-respected academic, and along with my colleagues, Anne, Erin, and Catherine. So I'm here today representing the organization. And tomorrow, in fact, Dr. Yo and myself will be sharing the stage for another talk on mental health and beyond, same time, 9 a.m. Malaysian time and 12 p.m. Australian time. So to move on, let's get started on the conversation. And what do we want to achieve today? In this short mini conversation that we are having today, and I call this a conversation intentionally, right? That it's as much as it's a mini workshop, but it is really a conversation that we're starting today. And that change that I was talking about, right? It really begins with the conversations like this that we are having and that Andrea has helped us organize. So we'll hope that you'll have a better understanding of the importance of men's mental health, why we cannot ignore it, the cultural norms of toxic masculinity, why it is difficult for men to share emotions and its implications in society, and finally breaking the stigma. What can we do to start the conversation for a change? So a quick icebreaker now. Just feel free to share your name or one word that comes to your mind about men's mental health. Example would be Amir, strong, weak, etc. So let's put that in the chat box, right? And then we can click enter together to see what do we understand by men's mental health. What's the first word that comes to your mind? I'm looking through now. Let's type. Great.
Come on, ladies and gentlemen, help Arman and put your comments in it. Some words that are describing for you. It was masculinity, right? Or mental health.
It's mental health, right? Men's mental health, masculinity, whatever that comes to your mind with the topic today, right? The first word that comes to your mind, maybe. Okay, so let's, if you have just typed out, let's all press enter together. I will do a quick countdown. 3, 2, 1. Yes, I hear, some responses. I won't read out the names because we are on just to give you a sense of privacy. But I think some of the comments that are coming out are frightened, strong. Men need to trust you in order to feel comfortable around you. Good point there. Trust, I think that also comes in. So frightened, strong, trust. Any other responses? Men are not allowed to cry. So men cry or men don't cry. So interestingly, in this audience this morning, it's I'm the only guy here representing, so you have to take my view into account there. And then as another response that's come in is vulnerable. Men need to show strength. So all these are very important points. And I think some of the expectations that we have in society about men, right? Whether it's about that they can't cry, they can't be vulnerable, they have to show strength. That's really central to the discussion that we're having today. Are these expectations realistic? Are these expectations helpful to men? Are these expectations helpful to society? Thank you again for your sharing. So let's get started. And please, at any point, I will share. I'll check the chat box from time to time. Feel free to share any comments, any feedback that you may have, or any questions that you may also have. So, and try this another response chat box. So there's a response from one of our participants here that men need to show strength, but men actually need to show vulnerability. So that's a part of our discussion today, right? So that how do we have this shift in our minds, right? Particularly for men and not only men, but men functioning in society that, that it's that in fact, I would argue to the last comment, right? That vulnerability can be your strength. So strength is not only the machoism that we see, but in fact, being able to be vulnerable. Okay, thank you for all your responses. So with that, let's continue. Let's continue looking at this image here. What do you see in that image? What do you think is happening here? Somebody's drowning, right? Somebody's trying to seek help. But what's happening? Is he able to seek help? Let's look again. So if you looked at that, the person who's seeking help as men's mental health, the hand that's extending out from is out there, society. But you know what? They're not pulling that man out who's drowning. They're doing a high five. Be a man. And what happens? The person drowns, right? So look, this is symbolically, I think that we're trying to represent here, right? That like an analogy here that how society deals with men's mental health. And at the end of the day, how it harms men and also society. So the question that I want you to think about throughout our discussion today is, what can men do differently? What can society do differently? What can you and I do differently? Okay, so let's look at some trends first about men's mental health first, even before going about toxic masculinity. So statistics show, right, men have difficulties talking about mental health. Yes, there's lower prevalence as far as statistics are concerned about mental health conditions facing men. And part of this could also be that men talk less about the mental health. So as a result, the prevalence is lower when we see statistics, right, about mental health conditions from depression, anxiety, and other formal mental health conditions. But at the same time, despite the lower prevalence, which could be, like I said, because of difficulties we're talking about it, there is a higher suicide risk. In fact, a study by the World Health Organization 2018 in developing countries found that the male to female suicide ratio is 1.6 to 1. So it's 1.6 times more likely that male will have cases of suicide. Again, bear in mind that this ratio is even higher in developed countries. So in developing countries, you see 1.6 times. It can be a much larger the number when it comes to the developed countries. So in other words, men, as far as reporting is concerned about mental health, the prevalence is lower in terms of the conditions, but the risk for suicide is much higher. And we've also found some studies, like the one of the studies I've quoted here, that shows that for male hospital patients who engage in self-harm, suicide intent was much higher compared to women. Men's mental health is also frequently overlooked and not taken seriously in society. And as a result, there's a reluctance to seek help. So it's a cycle that we found ourselves in, right? So we don't want to talk about it. No one else wants to talk about it. We don't seek help, and the problem just gets bigger every time. And there is a silent crisis we're facing here. And the reason we talk about the silent crisis being really silent is that men are really not likely to talk about their mental health symptoms or conditions that they're facing. So this brings us to a question to think about, right? What are some of the common mental health issues facing men? What are some of the challenges that they're going through? So for that, let's meet our friend Amir. Amir is 35 years old. What are some of his stresses? What is he going through? And we'll try to think about it from the context of the pandemic. We are all going through the pandemic, whether it's men, women, we are in society, all of us. But how do we really deal with it? But before that, what are Amir's challenges? Some of his stresses are financial stress. He's worried. Can I continue to support myself and my family? Do I have enough, in terms of financial, in terms of financially, am I able to afford the costs that that the family has? And there comes also with that, right? Gender stereotypes and assumptions we have in society. And the pressure on men as well, that men are the providers. Then there's work pressure. There's job insecurity and unemployment risks. He's aware that in his company, quite a few people were laid off. So he's worried what will happen to him as well. And that is spilling over at home. One thing that we realized, right, it's hard to compartmentalize between what happens at work and what happens at home. And there is more risk of conflict at home. And he sees that with his partner, his wife, there's actually much more discord in their relationship. And he's worried now, is this going to lead to a separation? And all that is happening at a time when there's social isolation. He's feeling lonely and detached. He doesn't get to see his colleagues. He doesn't get to see his friends. As it is, right, in society, quite often when men have to focus more on their career, they compromise some of their social needs. And as a result of that, now he's feeling even more isolated, even more detached. Men even normally find it difficult to share their emotions with anyone, and even more so now because there's because of the lockdown and the restrictions we've had. This also is affecting his sexual relationship actually, in terms of performance anxiety and stress. And his physical health is also affected. He's having some body aches. We know about psychosomatic when your body and your mind will be often interrelated, and he's having a lot of body aches. He's having sleeping difficulties. He doesn't have a substance abuse problem at this point, but he is worried about his health and his mental health as well, because he knows that often a harmful way of coping can be drugs and alcohol when you're having mental health challenges. And all these challenges are not necessarily a result of the pandemic, but they're definitely aggravated by the pandemic. They existed before COVID-19 as well, but COVID-19 has just made it worse because of the overall uncertainty and the isolation that we are in. So with that, let's move on to the responses. So some of these stresses I mentioned are not unique to men. Men and women both face the same stresses, but there's some dissimilarities in terms of how they respond. First, let's talk about violence. Unfortunately, the prevalence of violence and family violence perpetrated by men is very high. This can be in the form of aggression, dominance, control, and physical and sexual assault. I want you to also think about here family violence, right? Not only in the concept of physical violence, but also emotional violence. Emotional violence, financial violence are all also forms of abuse, right, which affect a family structure. And some of you may also wonder, right, that are we being unfair? Because, I mean, well, theoretically, right, family violence, the perpetrators and survivor, we assume that the perpetrators, men, and the survivor as women. Is that always the reality? Well, there are, of course, exceptions, and we'll take that into account. But if you look at statistics, right, overwhelmingly worldwide, you will see that men are actually the perpetrators of family violence. There may be exceptions. And even in the cases where men are actually the survivors, the perpetrator is still the men in most of those cases, for example, same-sex relationships. So something is happening here. The distresses are there, and the responses in terms of how it manifests, right, is violence, aggression, dominance, control, and often also assault, which can be the physical, sexual, or any other form, and emotional violence as well. So that's what happens to those around them in the family structure. But what about men themselves? Men also have a higher risk of depression. They're also facing a risk of depression, stress, body image, and also overall poor social functioning. When we talk about poor social functioning, we have to also take into account this affects work, this affects relationships, almost every aspect of society. We've also seen, right, during the economic crisis, and the statistics show the higher suicide rates amongst men. Sorry about that. So there's higher. So there's higher. So when it comes to there's a higher risk in a way, right? So, and the reason behind that is that the pressure and the social expectations, right, out of men. Men often have social expectations, right, that out of themselves and also from society, that they have to be the provider. And this often, during an economic crisis, when you're not able to do that, that may lead to an identity crisis. Am I being manly enough? If I'm going through financial difficulties and not able to support my family, am I being manly enough? Am I really living up to the expectations that I have for myself or society has out of myself? And that often leads to high suicide rates because of the frustration and feeling helpless in that situation. There is also a likelihood of substance abuse. So sometimes in dealing with the stressors, there is a higher risk of men really indulging in alcohol and other drugs in an abuse form. And this may also has an impact on, this may also have an impact on depression and increase in suicide risks. And all this is happening at a time, right, when men are actually less likely to seek professional help for their mental health. So it makes it even worse. So in a way, it's like a cycle, as I mentioned before, right, that men are being violent, men have a higher risk of also their stress, anxiety, depression. They also have sometimes body image problems. This affects their overall functioning.
Sorry, my problem, just push the button.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I'm not muted anymore. So yeah, so going back, right? So like I said, there's a high risk of violence, there's risk of depression, the pressure that leads to high suicide rates because of the provider, the risk of substance abuse, and all this happening, right, in a situation where men are less likely to seek professional help. And some of the other risk factors that increases prevalence of this, right, is childhood adversities. And when I talk about childhood adversities, we are, that when we have seen, right, and statistics show that when you grew up witnessing or experiencing abuse at home, it's likely that there's an intergenerational aspect of that when you grew up and become a perpetrator as well. This is classic, like, the findings, right, in mental health, that those who are bullied often get to be bullies themselves eventually. So there is a cycle here that we cannot ignore. So we have to break that cycle, because the child now who is a survivor of the aggression from his father is likely to grow up and be another male who may also be indulged in violence and aggression and become abusive in the future. So we have to think about this really beyond just what's happening to the family here, what's happening to the men that we're talking about, but actually long-term, right? What are the impacts on society? And this actually needs more gender-based interventions. We talk about mental health, right? Need for mental health awareness, need for mental health advocacy. and really access to mental health. But also particularly, right, men's mental health and women's mental health, there are different needs that we have, right? And there's a gender-based understanding that we need. So there are no single contributors, as we discussed. There are many stressors, but overall there is one trend, which is the suppression of emotions. So we have to ask ourselves here, right? How does the cultural and social expectations affect men's mental health? Are men setting themselves up for failure by living up to these expectations, right? Which often based on gender stereotypes, on toxic masculinity, which puts them at greater risk of mental health for themselves and also those around them. So let's move on to the concept of toxic masculinity. What is toxic masculinity? And how does it link to some of the behaviors that we mentioned just now? Toxic masculinity refers to attitudes and behaviors which are associated or expected of men that harms men and society. So what do we mean by these attitudes and behaviors? Some of the stereotypes, we grew up with them, and many of us are familiar with them, right? So, for example, boys don't cry, man up, real men don't seek help. So these are some of the assumptions that we have and stereotypes that we grew up with. And you internalize it in society, and particularly for men. And there are also traditional gender roles in terms of, men seen as being strong, the breadwinners. And these are the cultural norms that have been conditioned, right? And these traditional gender roles also reinforce toxic masculinity. There's also bottling up of emotions, because sharing feelings are perceived as weakness, and there's a difficulty in accepting vulnerability, as we discussed before. And that prevents them from seeking help, diagnosis, and treatment, and largely, right, some of the stresses that they have go unaddressed. And this is where we miss out the early signs, because we look at only the aggression, the anger, the irritability, and not really the underlying sadness, what's really happening. So some of the early signs, right, because men are hiding their vulnerability or concealing it, we can't really address it. And like I said, this also affects the psychosocial functioning, and it impacts on partners and families. So there is stigma on mental health. We're all aware about that, right, in general. But the stigma is heightened further by toxic masculinity. And the question is, what can we really do? And if you look at these expectations, right, it's not only society. Many times, men themselves have internalized this to the extent that they feel that they have to, have that strong machoism to actually, be a man. But this has long-term impacts for society in terms of some of the consequences we mentioned. Let's not forget, even in Australia, 1 in 6 women have actually survived family violence in their life. That's a high statistic, right? And the perpetrators are often men, as I mentioned. So moving on, what are some of the coping strategies? What are the things that we could do? First, for men, the first step is really literacy and awareness. And for this, society also needs to have the same literacy and awareness. We need to encourage men to understand the emotions and be comfortable with our emotions. So emotions are not your enemy. Emotions can actually be healthy. I often have clients, particularly male clients at different age groups, who come to me, oh, I'm too emotional. Of course, there's, sometimes we have, excess emotions or emotions which are, suppressed. Both can be a problem. But emotions itself are actually helpful. Emotions reflect needs. If you're feeling scared, that's a need. There's a certain need there. If you're feeling angry, even anger, right, is an emotion that can manifest in other forms than violence. If you're angry about something, you can make a change. You don't have to be violent. And I think this is where we need to really get men to have the conversation about the emotions, because once you do that, you can find out what are the thoughts, and that can help in problem solving. Then I think when it comes to friends, family, and colleagues, we need to reach out to men around us and encourage them to share and tell them that they're not alone. We also need men to address some of the stresses they're going through now through meaningful activities, whatever that it may be, skills, hobbies, religion. Just like any other person in society, men also have stresses that need to be addressed in a healthy way. There's also self-care. And self-care is not only a complacency. We often look at self-care in terms of, okay, self-care is about, just about yourself, but it's beyond that. It's about really a more healthier living. But it's eating, exercise, or sleeping, whatever way it is, it's bound to help and support not only yourself, but those around you. And finally, being able to seek help, right? If those stresses are there, instead of manifesting in terms of violence and aggression, you need to seek help for yourself and also for your family. And here we really need to have a shift of mindset. And so I would say that, that in the hierarchical way, right? First, I think these are the immediate coping strategies that men need. There's stresses that men are going through. And if we want to reduce the level of conflict that's happening in society, we need to adopt some of these coping strategies. Then we need to go beyond that. And at that next level, it's really about challenging some of those gender stereotypes that we have, which reinforce toxic masculinity. We need to get men to consider that, it's okay to share your emotions. It's okay to talk about your emotions. The problem that we have here, right, is that the only form of valid emotional expression for men in society that we have now is anger, which manifests in violence and aggression. Any other form of emotions are not seen manly enough. But you know what? If a man gets angry, if a man starts yelling at someone, that's manly. That's as far as society is concerned, right? But if a person is sad, if a person, the person seen as too emotional and not manly enough, this is where the underlying problem is, right? So we need a two-stage intervention. One, in terms of helping men at this point is what's happening, overcoming toxic masculinity and get them to help themselves, get help from others around them, and also seek professional help. And then finally, also, we have to start challenging some of the underlying social assumptions, right, that reinforce toxic masculinity. And seeking help is rational, courageous, and responsible. It's not vulnerability. In fact, seeking help can be a strength. And it can improve your quality of life and others. So that needs to start today. So moving on, a few last words. Mental health is important for all, including men. And there is a strong relationship that we see between toxic masculinity and poor mental health. And many men suffer in silence, and that is unhealthy and unsafe for them and also for the rest of society. Toxic masculinity makes it even difficult to reach help. As it is society, it's hard to really seek out help when you need help. There are cultural norms that we have on traditional gender roles, which prevents help seeking and adds emotional and that adds emotional pressure and also harms society. Sharing emotions is not really a weakness, but it can be courageous. And this is, I think, the point that we need to highlight as we break the trend of toxic masculinity. And long term, we need to shift some of the cultural stereotypes. And this has to really start from a young age. We have to encourage boys to have a healthy expression of emotion from childhood. So if you have a younger brother, younger sibling, younger son, or anyone, like change really has to begin with children today. And that's why I think it's important for you to start and helping them and asking them to address the emotions in a more healthy way. And that can be done by as simple as an emotional check-in, asking them, how are you feeling today? And asking them to go, people will probably reply by saying, happy, sad, angry. Ask them to break that down. And this is where change can really start with any of us here, right, in this room today. That if we want to break toxic masculinity, it's something that's happened over generations, right? And this harms, like I said, not only society and women and children, but also men themselves. And that's why we really have to be really mindful of our actions. When you have children, right, we don't say things like, oh, men don't cry or boys don't cry, or be manly enough, don't be such a girl. These are the kind of statements that we often make that really reinforces toxic masculinity. Okay, so I want to leave you with a last quote here before we open up discussions. And I think I'm just on time because we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. This quote is from American novelist from Norman Kingsley Mailer, and he said, masculinity is not something given to you, but something you gain. And you gain it by winning small battles with honor. So if it is all about being masculine by showing aggression, you're actually doing the opposite. So masculinity is not something that you're born with. If you really want to be masculine, You can do it by really winning the battles that you have around you. So seek help. And seeking help is really courage in that sense. And the silence that we have, that's not manly, that's really the enemy there. Finally, I think it's time to redefine masculinity. Look at these two images here, right? We need to normalize the idea that it's okay for boys to express their feelings and show their emotions without using violence. We need to change this mindset that the only acceptable form of emotional expression for men is anger and violence. So we need to overcome that, and from a young age, teach men that boys can be sensitive, caring, quiet, gentle, artsy, dreamers, scared, affectionate, and even pretty, perhaps, right? And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So change really has to begin with men seeking help now, and also seeing how we can make things different when it comes to the next generation, the boys today who will be men tomorrow, so that we can break this intergenerational cycle. Okay, finally, I'll open up Q&A, but before that, I also want to thank again Andrea from the Global Empowerment Summit for bringing us together, 200 speakers talking about really important issues of not only mental health, but really life and how we empower ourselves for a better living. And this is my second year with the Global Empowerment Summit, and I've told Andrea that I've attended many conferences in my life, presenting many of them. But I think what makes the Global Empowerment Summit stand out, right, is that it's a human conference that's inclusive, that brings different voices together, and most importantly, addresses topics that we often don't talk about. So it's really a real conference, right, on real issues which are important to us, like toxic masculinity. Today was just a brief introduction, and I hope that was helpful for you to at least start this conversation. In terms of, we went through what are the stresses men are going through, how toxic masculinity prevents them from seeking help, what are some of the changes that we can bring about in society, and finally, how this can actually benefit men just as the rest of society. So thank you very much. So I'll now open up to Q&A. I think we have roughly about 15 minutes for any questions that you may have and discussions. So we'll open it up there. And for the rest of our audience, our friends who've joined us in social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook, thank you for joining us. That's my email address. Please feel free to reach out to me, both for myself and the empowerment group. Mental health from a gender perspective is something we are committed to, and particularly to see how toxic masculinity, we can address that topic in society for better outcomes for all of us.